Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Joerg Raab. I'm an associate professor at the Tilburg University in the Department of Organization Studies and a co-editor of the journal Perspectives on Public Management and Governance. Also welcoming Kirk Emerson as the editor of the journal. And this is, I think, Kirk, somewhat as a first. We are showcasing 4 papers that have recently been published in PPMG around the topic digital transformation of public management. And if you look at the current developments, we see really tectonic shifts in terms of social and technological developments. But very often our thinking also in public management is still very much 20th century. Also at PPMG, we would like to sort of make the step ahead and think more in terms of what these changes actually not only mean for public organizations and public management, but also for our theorizing. And therefore, we are very glad that we have 3 authors of these recent papers with us today. So the 4 papers are by Alex Ingrams, Susanne Piotrowski and Daniel Berliner on open government. Then by Matthew Young, Artificial Intelligence and Administrative Evil, with co-authors Johannes Himmelreich, Justin Bullock, and Kyung-Jul Kim. Another paper by Matthew Young, Justin Bullock, and Jesse Lise on artificial discretion. And last but not least, Shalini Misri, Patrick Roberts, Matthew Rhodes on the ecology of emergency management work in the digital age. There's some sort of Netherlands bias here because both Alex and Matt are by now in Leiden University and I'm at Tilburg. And I think that's just by chance, but it's also not an accident because the Netherlands are quite advanced in terms of digitalization of government services. And we also had recently seen the downsides, namely 2 big scandals in which people really got hurt. Matt will also talk about administrative evil and where digitalization also played a big role. So first, a short introduction of our authors. Start with Shalini Misri. Shalini is an associate professor at Virginia Tech, got her PhD in 2010 from the University of California and has a very illustrious and diverse career, both in terms of geography, India, Germany, and the US, but also in terms of scientific fields. And she's sort of new to public management. But therefore, we also value your, let's say, fresh perspectives on questions that we are interested in. Then we have Matt Young, who is an assistant professor of public administration at the University of Leiden here in the Netherlands. Got his PhD at USC in 2017, and has already an illustrious list of publications in public administration review, public management review, in PPMG and information polity, and is generally interested in, let's say, digital technologies and the implementation in public organizations. And then we have Alex Ingrams, who also got his PhD in 2017, but at the other side of the US, namely at Rutgers University in Newark, in New Jersey. And is also now an assistant professor at Leiden University here in the Netherlands. And also he has a very illustrious and long list already of publications around digital technologies, digital transformation, open government in the core public management journals like Public Administration Review, Journal of Behavioral Public Administration, and International public management journals. So also young blood, I would say, to our field. So that's exciting. Therefore, I would like to kick off the meeting. So we are now 31 participants. So that still works, that if you want to raise a question, you can ask that the other participants. I think with that group size, we were still able to do that. And just raise your virtual hand or put it in the chat, and then I will call on you to unmute. Would also be nice if you then can switch off your camera so we can see you. So as a first round, I would like the authors to basically summarize the 3 key findings of each paper for 5 minutes, and we start with Alex.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and a pleasure to be here and to see everyone who's joined, and looking forward to a good discussion later on, hopefully with lots of questions and back and forth, because these are really important topics, and yeah, I'm indebted to Joerg and the others for bringing this together. I think the 3 key takeaways from our paper, I think, should segue into the discussion nicely, because my first key takeaway is about what we can learn from historic attempts at public sector reform, of which more technology-oriented types of reform are only a more recent chapter, but we can still learn a lot about those. Then I'll make a comment more specifically about open government as a type of reform, and then I'll make it more of a bridge to these issues in the context of artificial intelligence. Now, the first key takeaway, public sector reforms are always, to a certain extent, destined to fall short of what their ideologues expect them to be at the outset. And so in our paper, we use quite a high-level conceptual heuristic as a way of unlocking the different spheres where reforms can take place. And we use these terms, we look at the means and the ends of the reforms, and we look at their dimensions in terms of whether they're focused on internal types of reforms and external types of reforms. And these rather abstract categories are used as a way of getting into the language that's used in previous reformers over the last century or so, and understanding what they were trying to do, and looking at where their weak areas were. So, for example, using scientific management tools such as Luther Gulick's POSDCorp as a means, this concept of a means or a tool to achieve an end of control and efficiency, or the focus of new public management on both internal reforms, such as delegation and decentralization, or an external reform, such as using competitive bidding processes, which change the way that government organizations engage with their environment. So we thought this would be a good way to break down the ideas of previous reformers into their principal components and analyze where they went wrong. And we break those components into 4 categories of problems: implementation problems, goal ambiguity, structural barriers, and political conflicts. And we find that prior public sector reforms encountered problems in each of these categories, and we go into quite a systematic way of expanding on what those problems could look like in the real world. Our second contribution is to see open government as an approach to public sector reform that has promising ideas, but also has some glaring weak spots that will need to be addressed if it's going to be successful. So we take the open government reform movement as an interesting and an important case to explore this framework of understanding the weaknesses inherent in previous reform ideas. And we use evidence from the Open Government Partnership, which is a transnational multilateral organization that's driven many of these open government efforts globally. And we find many weaknesses in these ideas that have been put forward. Not just ideas, but also real open government programs and initiatives from a range of different countries around the world. We find these weaknesses to be very striking, though we stop short of predicting what may happen to the open government movement in the future. We're not engaging in any type of prediction per se, But the things that stand out for us in terms of open government are there's big gaps between promise and reality in open government programs, meaning that it appears in practice to have a high rate of failure, if at least we define failure as not fulfilling what you initially promise you're going to fulfill. There's a strongly citizen-oriented aspect of open government, which leads to organizational decoupling that makes it both susceptible to rhetoric and to failure. There's a lack of definition and ambiguity in the concept of open government, and this leads to open government being difficult to build systematically. And it also means that different interest groups are pulling in different directions, giving the reform rather a just disjointed or a messy appearance. Finally, about open government, its reliance on technology makes it susceptible to goal displacement and resource challenges, especially in less economically developed countries. My final takeaway, and this is where I bridge more into the world of artificial intelligence that we inhabit today. And some of these things that affect open government are really an inherent part of modern day governance challenges. And we would expect these to continue in other areas of reform too. So broader than open government per se is a particular way of trying to reform the way that government works. And so this does tie in particular with digitalization challenges. And governments are forced to collaborate more with industry and other governments today in trying to develop better capacity for artificial intelligence. And in doing so, there are difficult trade-offs to be made between things like transparency and security, public participation and efficiency, and a difficult governing environment, currently with very little technology regulation, meaning that disentangling democratic and anti-democratic impacts of technologies is something we will increasingly need to grapple with moving into the future.
Great, thanks, Alex, for your opening statement. Now, basically, from the hope of open government as a government of integrity, transparency, supported by the internet, as you put it in your paper, to sort of the dark side and administrative evil. Matt.
Thank you very much. So, yes, this paper maybe is mostly a cautionary tale, and I think that was certainly our intention in writing it. But to summarize the key takeaways, I think the first was that we wanted to provide a way for scholars and practitioners really to think about how you can get from the sort of conceptual idea of bureaucracies producing large-scale harms. And there's the common reference point of the Nazi era of Germany, but I think more importantly, in the actual administrative evil book and theory, they talk about more, or rather less intentional instances of that sort of harm coming out of it. And it speaks also to Arendt's sort of banality of evil. So, how do we get there? Well, if we use and adapt some of the existing key theoretical insights from the sort of political science, hybridized approach to thinking about public administration and management, as far as the delegation problem between principals and agents, right? That can both shed a little bit more light on how you might actually get from A to, I suppose I should say Z, now that I'm living in Europe. So from A to Z, while actually having these systematic changes come in from new technology that, and this goes to both of the papers that I'm representing here, this technology is fundamentally different on account of the fact that it is not simply the pre-programmed sort of logical and value assessment of a human engineer taking design guidelines or principles from a human product manager. right? These are systems that have some human input into their parameterization, but ultimately, if they're sort of left to their own devices, they're effectively making decisions in a way that's much more human-like than prior generations of this technology. So in that sense, right, there's a lot of different social forces, economic forces, and market forces in particular that are all sort of gathering like storm clouds to really put pressure to the public sector in terms of adopting this. And this is, we talk about as the AI exuberance principle, as well as the sort of techno-rationality principle, right? There's this idea that everything that matters can be measured and can be quantified. And so if we just throw it into an arbitrarily complex neural network, we'll get good outputs over time. And what we're starting to see through the use of these more complex algorithms, the second takeaway here is that they can actually produce serious and material harm. So you alluded to the problem in the Dutch context that came to light earlier this year. Right? These are instances where decisions were made with the assistance of these sorts of technologies that not only led to the separation and breakup of families in the short to medium term, but in several cases actually led to people committing suicide. Right? These are not small scale harms where your car got a parking ticket when you shouldn't have. This is the real deal. So for my final point, I'll try to put a little bit of a silver lining on this cloud and say that the third takeaway is something that we believe is one of the few ways that this technology could actually be put to task in a way that could mitigate some of these risks. And that is to basically use AI in the service of auditing public sector decision-making. In computer science, there's actually an already sort of understood way of doing that in terms of generalized adversarial networks, right? Basically, they are the custodiet ipsos custodes, right? Guarding the guardians or watching the watchmen, depending on how you like to conjugate your Latin. And so in putting them to use in that way, there may be some room, right, to mitigate the risk of evil. The problem is those social, market, and economic forces are all mostly driving the public sector to the extent that they're going to use it for audits to look for efficiency gains in terms of preventing fraud, not preventing material evil. So yeah, I'm back to storm clouds, but thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Now we go to Shalini and a different perspective, also an empirical paper. So what do emergency managers actually do with digital technologies?
That's right. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with all of you and share some ideas. So my colleagues and I were really interested in understanding the psychological and behavioral responses of public managers in response to technological change. And we're particularly interested in one aspect of technological change, and that's the digital information landscape. What does the digital information landscape do to the cognitive, affective, and behavioral responses of this particular category of public managers, emergency managers? So what we did was we talked to county-level emergency managers across the United States, from urban, suburban, and rural counties, and we triangulated that data with some archival research. In order to frame our understanding of behavioral responses, we used a really established social psychological theory called person-environment fit. And person-environment fit essentially is that individuals and groups respond to small-scale as well as larger-scale structural environmental change by essentially two processes: optimization and passive adaptation. So in optimization, people are trying to change something about their environments to make it in alignment, to be congruent with their values and needs and motivations. And passive adaptation is when they really don't have any recourse, and they passively adapt to the structural, environmental, organizational change. And what we saw in our sample of emergency managers is evidence of this incongruencies, these tensions in response to the digital landscape. So one of the things that we saw, continuing with Alex's theme of ambiguity, is this role ambiguity and role conflict. The role ambiguity was when emergency managers did not find their roles to be specific or predictable. And role conflict really happened when there was a tension between what the digital world expected of them and what they thought their role and job was supposed to be. Another category of kind of a finding or change was the ceding of power and autonomy and agency to these digital tools and technologies. So while emergency managers really, almost categorically reported that this empowers the public, they found that the technology really impedes their agency and autonomy and power in the workplace. And I'll talk about that in response to another question. And the third really finding was that the emergency managers really cited the critical importance of the change in organizational routines and boundaries because of the struggles of coping with chronic overload and this role ambiguity and role conflict. So the need for different organizational routines, different task design, and skills and expertise to cope with this onslaught of digital information was the third finding in the study.
Great, thanks a lot. And then we bring it back to Matt. On artificial discretion, which I think also nicely connects to some of the issues that Shalini just talked about.
Yes, absolutely. So, in this paper, rather than being more strictly doom and gloom, as with the previous, we were really trying to lay out some arguments for how to think about how we should hold the public sector in some ways accountable for implementing these new technologies in a way that is at least as well thought out as we can hope, right? And again, as with the use of principal agent theory in the previous paper, here we really wanted to highlight that there are existing tools in our collective toolbox as scholars of public administration and management to think about how we could sort of lay the theoretical groundwork for making that then work empirically. And so in this case, we look to Lester Salomon's tools of governance approach from the early part of this still relatively early century. But there's 5 different ways in which any given tool of governance can or ought to be evaluated. And some of them will be more germane in different contexts than others. But here, before we even get to the sort of post hoc evaluation, one of the points that we make in this article is that when a decision maker is evaluating whether or not to introduce this sort of technology into existing processes, the comparative case to use is not like a theoretical Platonic ideal of a human decision maker, or for that matter, a straw man of a lazy or incompetent person who's just there to collect paychecks, right? It's really crucial to use the material reality on the ground of how good are we as an organization, as individuals embedded within this organization, right, at these different levels, how good are we at making decisions without these tools in the first place? And, as a logical follow-up to that, how much better could we conceivably be, right? And exactly what better means is both multifaceted and in many cases contested, right? Which also gets to, I think, a lot of Alex's points and his co-author's points in his paper. So related to that also is this idea that we really think, to the extent that different tasks in the day-to-day activities of the public sector involve different amounts of discretion on the part of the individual decision maker. And you can, as a general guide, sort of ascribe different ways in which that degree of discretion is systematically varied, right? That can give us a lens for thinking about what the potential best case fit between technology / tool and purpose or task really is or is likely to be, given both the advantages and the limitations of the technology and the advantages and the limitations of people. And so it's important to note, and this is something that Shalini's article gets at, and the theories that she brings to the table, I think really also help highlight discrete tasks, right? Whatever sort of decision you're making in any given moment is also embedded in a much more complex and difficult to parse out material and institutional context. And there's no running away from that. You have to give it its due, and you have to sort of muddle through. So that's another one of our takeaways. And then related to our use of Salomon, I would say that it's important to be as broad-based or as ecumenical as you can in terms of defining what your evaluative criteria for the use of this sort of technology are going to be. And that's both in terms of in making the go, no go decision for adoption, but then also should you choose to adopt and then implement in designing beforehand and then carrying out the actual post hoc evaluations of what happens. And again, that's where we think that Salomon's framework provided a really useful pre-existing lattice for us to discuss how we might want to actually evaluate these tools and adjust our decisions accordingly.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think that opens up a wide field for possible comments and questions. So I would like to ask the participants to address them. Yeah, Brandon, go ahead.
First into the breach. So I'm curious about sort of the role of CIOs in specifically about administrative evil, because I don't think that they would conceptualize a lot of these tools as administratively evil, but more as errors in a system. And I'm curious how that matches up with Matt's framework with the decisions that get made within sort of institutional governance.
Who wants to pick that up first? Matt?
So I'd actually like to see if Shalini wanted to raise a point, because I know that her article also specifically called out CIOs.
Okay, good. Shalini?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking about some of the specific comments our emergency managers made, and many, maybe 50% of the managers that we interviewed did not have a chief information officer at all. So these were 1-2 men kind of outfits, really managing, and some of them, and they had some volunteers, and they were completely inequipped to engage with this digital world. But the ones that did have, chief info, like the emergency management, county level emergency management office in Washington, D.C. or in Arlington, for example. They had not only one, but perhaps six, half a dozen, kind of chief information officers. And they felt very competent in handling the flow of information. In fact, they were completely devoted to this idea of, well, of course the information will be distributed and processed, and then we get the nuggets, that we will use for our decisions. I know maybe this is not a direct answer to your question, but in terms of the differences in how the role of the chief information officer kind of plays out in terms of the size and the staffing levels and the skills and expertise of these emergency managers, this is the way that it seemed to play out in at least crisis management.
Louise, go ahead. Or Matt, do you want to add something?
Oh, I just wanted to also add in a direct answer to Brandon's question that I think there's actually some good room for empirical investigation into that question, right? And you can imagine that there's both characteristics inherent to the CIO as an individual that are maybe likely to make them more or less predisposed to take a risk management based approach to these technologies, or to be more sort of pro move fast and break things. But then within the organization itself too, CIOs are embedded with varying degrees of institutional and formalized authority. And so to the extent that you could systematically observe variations in those structures across different organizations, you definitely have my interest.
Thanks, Louise.
Muted, Louise, you're muted. Louise, you're muted.
Sorry. One of the things that has been really a big concern for me for the last 10, 15 years is that to use these digital technologies, one honestly has to create a knowledge base. And when you create the knowledge base, you're deciding what to put in and what to leave out. And many times what is left out contributes to what has been increasingly under scrutiny here in the States as systemic racism, or systemic ability to ignore certain groups of people, certain areas of the country, certain aspects that leave out the whole system. And so it's almost a latent structural design that is included in a digital system that once it's in place becomes increasingly difficult to change and to address. And the evidence is that the people who are using it say, well, look at all my categories. I'm not racist. I'm putting all of these things in, but it's really the people who aren't heard, who aren't involved in the initial design of that system that are left out. And I wonder if you have seen this or if you have any way of addressing it, because it's really part of a socio-technical system. It's the social organizational aspect that is failing, and the technical system is actually very systematically and very effectively leaving out people.
Alex, do you want to pick that up?
Sure. No, I think it's a really important point. And I think I agree absolutely that there are these systematic problems that are magnified when we use these big data tools that rely on the way that we've collected and sorted data and the way that we program decision-making tools. And I think, I I mean, firstly, one way into this is to understand it as a pre-technological problem, right? And so with the problem with discrimination, we have both intentional forms of discrimination and non-intentional forms of discrimination, right? Implicit bias or structural discrimination, and these two things are strongly interlinked. And I think if we can approach big data tools, artificial intelligence, in that way, by understanding, firstly, that we can have these sort of intentional and non-intentional problems that can become part of our technological solutions, that gives us a starting point for how we can start to address those problems. And the second remark or reaction is there is growing interest in involving citizens in co-design processes of algorithms, so that there's more accountability and more realism about the types of impacts that could happen. I'm also still looking for really good examples of that being done in practice, and I haven't encountered any yet. I don't know if there's anyone else here in our virtual room who has some experience of those working in practice. But those are going to start to become increasingly necessary. Involving stakeholders from an early stage in the design of algorithms.
If I may suggest an application of the opposite, where it was left out, one of the huge problems in the US has been this anti-vaccine hesitancy. And a large part of that was due, many people suspect, to the fact that key groups were left out of the design for giving the information to the vaccines. And here comes a group of elite, physicians, public health experts, and so on. And they're represented by government agencies, and people in Black and brown and migrant communities say, hey, wait a minute, no one asked us. And so the rumors that, of course, are circulating, and they come from many sources, really do not take into account the fact that members of these communities were not included in the design, and many of them were not included in the testing populations. And so, learning after the fact that this is has been a very large contributing factor to the anti-vaccine phenomenon, not only in this country, but I think in other countries around the world. It's a major lesson for us to learn in public policy.
I absolutely agree. I think we can really learn from that. There's really no excuse in the medical context for making those kinds of mistakes. And in the technological context, we're just starting to realize about the impact of artificial intelligence, and we need to learn swiftly from those sorts of examples about the impacts that can take place if all the relevant individuals are not involved early on in the phase. So yeah, I quite agree.
That brings me to a question where we maybe could tie that together, and that is the question whether sort of in the interpretation of using these technologies, it's more about efficiency, effectiveness, and failure, but not so much about values, right? Maybe you could address that also from your research. I mean, how do Shalini? How do emergency managers look at this? What's the framing? Is this technological rationality, or also basically a value judgments that sort of also are part of these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. This is a really good question. one of the ways that these digital technologies has transformed the emergency management field from what we hear from practitioners is this they question the positive thing, they question the technology. So many of them were worried about the longer term consequences of over dependence and over reliance on digital tools and technologies. So, for example, managers spoke of the cognitive burdens of chronic overload, the ability to think critically, and question the information that they receive. They also question the adequacy and the fit of the digital tools that they use, because even though these are, the web EOC, for example, a highly customizable tool, but the emergency managers don't really have the skills and the expertise to customize it. So they just use it out of the box, and they're fitting in information and data, collecting so much data to be able to fit it inside this particular tool, to use it as a decision support system when the disaster or crisis arises. But it's not really very useful during the time of a disaster or crisis, and they recognize that. So, one of the emergency managers we talked to, I distinctly remember, had an army military background, and he says, in fact, there's a conscious effort to disregard the information that is coming from the decision support system, and to really categorize the information that is coming through during a disaster. Only categorized by ask and tell. In the first hour, we just go for ask. In the second and third hours, we just go for tell, and and kind of ignore a lot of the information that is coming in. So this need for more customizable tools, and that points to what Alex just said: tools that are developed through a participatory design approach that actually align and fit with the particulars of the task. And finally, these emergency managers they really wanted more nimble, more flexible routines that facilitate the processing of this digital information. One of the things that's a really big challenge for emergency managers, because of their background. Many of them come from, they're police officers, they're 911 kind of dispatchers. Many come from the military. This change in communication norms, right? They are used to rigid, one-way, sparse, detailed, communication that they control, the communication that comes out, to this world in which they have to be flexible and fast-paced and pithy and tweet out things, develop a social media profile, in fact, develop credibility online even before the disasters. This ability to tolerate this ambiguity, embrace new ways of working, is a challenge for many emergency managers who are not ready to accept, these changes in communication norms. For example, they're really uncomfortable tweeting out things when they have not verified the information, but they are in pressure. They feel pressure to do it because otherwise they don't control the narrative, and it's too late if they don't do that, because there's so much misinformation and rumor. The intensification of exchanges is another kind of big change that has occurred in emergency management. So not only do they have to communicate with the public very often with these new norms, but they also have to communicate with public officials. So public officials are asking them, well, why haven't you tweeted out something about this tree that has fallen, on the street over here? Well, so they talk of this ungluing of their work, the demands that this workplace and the resources, cognitive resources, organizational resources, staffing resources, human resources, that this constant communication takes away from what they perceive their actual job to be. So for this field, I think these are some of the the big transformations that have taken place in terms of the digital landscape.
Thanks. Greta, you have a question? Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting discussion. All of you tackled on a few things. The need to, move forward in the use of design and, and involving both the users, and you were just talking about police officers or public
Mhm.
managers in the design of solutions, and the need to go communicate. And that, I think, pairs up with the need to leverage expectations from all type of stakeholders. Now, how do you envisage this into, this is something that is quite established in the literature in service design, but it's not very well established. And also in the literature related with technology, it's not very well established in the literature of public administration, for instance, or like it doesn't really fit into that. What do you think is the glue that brings it together? Is it related with suggesting additional tools based on what Alex was saying upon the ones we already have, or is it related with how would you tackle this type of issues related with the need for design, the need for additional collaboration, communication, and eventually the measurement of results that go beyond efficiency and organizational performance? Thanks.
Shalini, you want to pick that up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't want to blather on over here, but seems I've been talking a lot. A couple of things. I think it not to be too simplistic about this, but I really think that this requires a kind of addressing some of the issues requires a cross-level, coordinated, integrated approach. For example, the technological readiness part. In our research, we found that these intrapersonal factors interact with the organizational level factors, which also interact with the interorganizational level factors that result in some of the responses. So managers who are not technologically ready, do not want to embrace new ways of working, and then are coupled with organizational systems, routines, and tasks that are rigid and inflexible and do not allow for a lot of autonomy, have worse behavioral responses and poorer effectiveness and efficiency. The issue, and I don't have an answer for you, so don't ask me how, because that's something to really think about. But redesigning of tasks, for example, how might we redesign particular tasks and routines? This is really micro level to address some of the kind of behavioral responses and problems in terms of particular effectiveness and efficiency kind of outcomes, right? So task redesign and organizational routines. Managers who did this really well and who were able to optimize, they even in emergency management offices that had only 1 or 2 people working, they were able to collaborate with chief information officers in other agencies and units to handle some of the load. So this nimbleness and prior collaborative connections, with other agencies is something that could be formalized. That could be another way of addressing it. The third is this idea of distributed cognition, right? We hear about, the possibility of humans and machines and humans across different agencies collaborating on a particular problem or task, complex problem or task, and then later integrating that knowledge. How possibly could that be done to lower some of the cognitive burdens that emergency managers face? How could we use this idea of distributed cognition and the integration of knowledge? And the fourth is really critiquing these technologies. The narrative is that these technologies will come in and reduce the cognitive burden, and we have so much time for leisure, and then we can do all the creative work. That managers can really focus on actual decision making and problem solving. But what we actually find is that there are a lot of offloading behaviors onto these technologies that result in suboptimal responses, right? So automation bias is one of these responses. So one of the things to really empirically study is under what conditions can advanced digital technologies actually optimally improve cognitive processes, and in what conditions are they leading to kind of suboptimally behaviors and responses. So I think that so that would be my response to kind of this question.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, so what I would add to that as well is that this is something, a problem that abstracts to really all of the market-based web technologies, in particular problems that we seem to be coming to a head on with respect to social media in particular, and that is the hidden costs that are basically amortized away under the rug, but that cost has to be made up somewhere else. So in that broader context, it becomes all of us being the actual product and not the actual consumer. In the particular case of the public sector, if we want to embrace the idea that you need to invest in participatory design structures and that you need to really invest in properly scoping out the goodness of fit between the technology and the task and the task to the broader context, all of that takes time and money. And most public sector organizations in the Western world at this point are very, very light on Slack resources, which means if you don't properly cost it out, if you don't properly budget the time, right, it becomes an unfunded mandate. And it's just going to get dropped. It's going to get dropped by the public sector. It's also going to become part of the marketing hype of the private vendors who are looking to sort of come in and opportunistically make a deal, right? And they might pitch that, hey, we've designed our system with a lot of participatory elements to them. But if you look at what the private sector is doing, they're still walking around and stepping on rakes every other step, right? With like, oh gosh, we forgot to include people of color in the training data of a system for facial recognition. Like, it's 2021, folks. Like, you can't, you're a multi-billion-dollar company and you're still making those kind of mistakes. Like, can we really expect the public sector to do any better if we're not willing to actually put the money up front to give them the space? I don't think that's realistic.
Thanks, Brandon.
Well, I was just going to note that I see a lot of the same reoccurring patterns of resource constraints in a lot of the discussions and papers that I've seen on this. But I sort of imagine this more like an externality, right? Less than sort of a systematic bias, but more of like there's externalized costs that sit on others that are not being internalized by these actors. And I'm curious how that squares with some of the experiences all of the authors have talked about, where would an incentive-based structure that a government could either develop through regulatory action or voluntarily adopt start resolving some of these issues, or would it just continue to perpetuate, in your view, what's been going on?
Alex, could you comment on that?
Sure. It's the $1 million question, really. Literally the $1 million question, $1 billion question, as well. In Europe, the EU is currently drafting its new regulations towards AI, and I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at those at the drafts, but they're very interesting and very, very tough on use of automated decision making in any sector in government and business. And it basically develops a kind of classification system whereby any type of micro targeting or paying very focused attention to human personality traits or behavior with an intention to nudge or shape behavior, all of those things will effectively become illegal, and there will be a lot of attention given to very high risk types of automation being used. So if you fit a kind of high risk classification, you have to take very special protective measures to ensure that your programming is done without any harmful effects on people. So we're of course yet to see what the implications of that type of regulation will be. Though, you know, if the alternative at the moment is the kind of self-regulating systems that we have at the moment, which leave a lot of discretion to private companies, as already been mentioned, decisions that public agencies make, I think we're going to just increasingly see these types of errors occurring. And you know, regulation comes with its own sets of problems. So we won't have heard the last word on that in the EU once the regulation is passed. But you know, I think this has to be part of our efforts at the governance of these types of technologies in the future, in some shape or form. And you know, the US context, where many of our participants today are from, you know, there are challenges. There are different types of challenges in the way that regulatory systems work, but there has to be some type of regulation for these types of technologies.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. May I?
Yeah, please chip in.
Real quick. So one challenge for maybe the more Wild West approach of my home country when it comes to incentive structures versus regulation, right? If you want to design a system of incentives that's meant to induce change in the behavior of another system, right? With the sort of technology, human interaction in governance decision-making, that system of regulation has to be at least as complex as the system it's regulating. That's like a cybernetics sort of proof. And what I think that means, what that distills, is that if you want to have the best shot at being able to develop that sort of institutional framework, you would actually need both the academic research community and the public sector itself to sort of swallow its pride, or whatever you want to call it, and actually start explicitly thinking about things in terms of systems engineering and systems design. And we'd also need a fair amount of descriptive empirical work just to understand what the actual landscape of the system looks like in practice. Now, from an institutional design perspective, right, I'm not going to get any descriptive research published in any high impact factor journal in public administration because, well, where's your causal identification and so on and so forth, right? So we as a community also need to sort of get real with ourselves about what the right empirical and theoretical approaches are to helping the public sector figure something like that out. On the American side, the only branch of government I've ever known to take systems engineering and cybernetics seriously is the Department of Defense. Everyone else just sort of pretends it doesn't exist, but that would have to change.
Thanks, Kirk. Last question on that round, and I want to shift the discussion a little bit. So, Lucy, I hope you're not too upset, but I will bring you in later, hopefully with one of the other topics that we still want to discuss in the last 30 minutes. Kirk, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you all for your presentations and your papers. we're very pleased to be publishing them and hosting this gathering. It sounds like from Shalini's description of the lack of trust and capacity of whether they're information managers or emergency managers, and then the systemic structural, administrative evil that's been raised by Matt and his work and his co-authors. I'm wondering if we need to conceptualize a new role, some kind of intermediary, calibrator, trusted, but very high capacity cadre of those who can in fact help facilitate these, if not co-design, sort of calibration of the framework of a system to the local or particular context in which they're being placed, so they can both build confidence of the users and which can be broadly based, of course, clients as well, or citizens as well as managers, but also ferret out some of these systemic bias issues that need to be looked at. So it just occurs to me, perhaps a new set of roles and tasks, but placed in some intermediary institutional context might be needed here.
Alex, you wanna start?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, and it occurs to me that I don't know what where the right place to find that role is within government, but I've done some work in the US context on regulations.gov, or the requirement within the APA that regulations with a significant public interest are subject to an open public feedback window of public comment making, and I think I think that's probably not quite what the kind of thing you have in mind, although that process itself is the sort of responsibility for oversight of that mechanism is with the OMB, and a similar type of process could be played for giving oversight and transparency and public participation in proposals on new automation tools that have a significant public risk.
Shalini?
This is so interesting, Kirk, that you ask this, because in areas in non-public management and other areas of management, there have been studies, like in banking, for example, there have been studies of the impacts of introduction to automation on the quality of decisions of a higher level, hierarchical organization, kind of higher level managers or bankers, and kind of lower level, entities within the organization. And one of the things, and this is kind of longitudinal ethnographic research, one of the things that these authors found was exactly what you were saying. They did not have a role, a particular person who would question these technologies, but groups that co-constructed, critiqued, talked about, what the automation tool and technology was producing with their superiors, right? They produced more, better insights as compared to these lower level bankers who sort of, did not know much about the field, but kind of took the results as presented to them, and kind of just showed it to the bankers. I mean, I think there is a way of translating that kind of role to the public managerial sector as well. So we have this in smaller inside social psychology when we talk about groupthink, for example. One of the strategies of reducing groupthink or eliminating groupthink is to have this devil's advocate, have someone play that devil's advocate role, or separate the group if there is too much groupthink, to kind of reduce some of those biases. And I think some of those task redesign strategies should be experimented. Maybe we should have a kind of quasi-experimental kind of study to see whether these are effective. So I really appreciate that idea.
Okay, thanks. I want to sort of shift the discussion now a little bit, sort of more to theory development and future research for the last 25 minutes. So the question to you three is, so from your research, what would you say, are there any peculiarities when doing research on digitalization in public management? In the beginning, I mentioned that all three of you use sort of fairly traditional, if I may say so, theoretical approaches to look at that. Is that the way forward, or do we need different kind of maybe new combinations? Matt just mentioned cybernetics, for example, to really understand what's going on. Wants to start? Matt, maybe?
Sure, be happy to. So I do think that I don't know that it would be possible to fully specify the set of theoretical approaches that one would need to cover every particular contingency, but the broader point is definitely that more often than not, you will need some degree of either inter or multidisciplinary approaches to really properly frame and understand the phenomenon of interest in this particular context. And I think that's further complicated by the fact that we have a bit of a fish and water problem, right? So I think, or at least the first time I ever saw it was in a piece by Paul Leonardi in Management and Information Science Quarterly on this idea of technological imbrication, or like the sort of layering of bricks into a pattern. And it's, this idea that as more and more relatively minor technologies are added to an existing process, right, organization, or simply way of doing things, you can become inured to the fact that substantive changes happened. And what that means oftentimes is I get really interested in a question about the use of digital technologies in the public sector, and both the users of those technologies and reviewer number 2, and sometimes even reviewer number 3 will go, well, yeah, but that's just par for the course. Like there's no there, it's just technology. There's not, like, what possible story could that have? And so I think you also just have to be very careful as a researcher in this field to be as compelling, right, and as clear. What I've taken away from those sorts of rounds of rejection is that I wasn't doing a good enough job in many cases in clearly articulating why it's important. But sort of drawing on those different theoretical approaches and explaining why they're important and why they're relevant to our field, qua public policy, public administration, public management. And that's just, it's a hard needle to thread. Multidisciplinary research is always difficult, I would say. But that's probably my biggest peculiarity.
Thanks, Shalini.
Yeah, I mean, my comment is not going to be, just for public management or public administration, but, for studying digitization and the experiences and responses to digital technologies in any setting. I think that it's really important, just drawing on Matt's points over here, really important to situate technologies as a part of the sociocultural milieu, the context, the organizational context, and to look at these technologies as in conjunction with the psychosocial, the intrapersonal, the intra-organizational, the inter-organizational, and the broader structural factors, and to look at them, as not as an independent variable. The technology caused this. Independent variable technology, some outcome variable. As the response, as psychologists usually tend to do, but to look at the effective context. To really look at them as moderators, and to look at a plethora of moderators that kind of explain or add nuance to that relationship. And I already talked about this example of technological readiness, so I'm not going to repeat that. But that was a kind of an example of why it's important to look at individual or smaller group responses to technologies, and to design more not like kind of one size fits all interventions or solutions to some of the challenges that we are facing with the way the technologies are implemented in the public sector.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Shalini just said, which I think is an excellent point to focus on specific technologies and tasks and understanding the types of impacts that these have, because of course, all technologies are so different, and they all have different types of impacts. And related to this point, I think it can really help, and connecting to Matt as well about sort of research collaboration, I think it can really help to work more closely with technology specialists, computer engineers, information scientists, because in my experience, when I bring many of the ideas about cutting edge research on technology and public administration to my colleagues that work in technology, it just doesn't compute, pun intended, and it's as if we're just talking past each other. And I think that collaboration in particular can give us much better insights into how specific technologies work and what the challenges are, and prevent us from not being too pessimistic, because I think we can, we don't want to be overly optimistic, but I think we can also be too pessimistic, because technologies are very important for governance and for problem solving. A couple of other points I think are to, on the one hand, making things more applied and practical, but on the other hand, connecting more clearly to fundamental concepts in public administration. And there's increasingly ideas that are fundamental to our field that technology scholars are starting to grapple with. I think particularly in Matt's work, the idea of bureaucratic neutrality, this whole idea is now coming back into focus, and Weber's ideas are being looked at again through the idea of technological rationalism. But there are so many others. Organizational design has come up. Herbert Simon, a very important figure in our field, and we haven't done enough to connect there. Ecosystem ways of thinking, right? Concepts of the organism, Chester Bernard, these types of ideas. We have so many good foundations in our field that we can connect with better. And then relatedly, another core concept in our field, that the politics administration divide. This is something that's really being tested in our concepts of technological neutrality and influence of politics on technology. And for me, this calls for not just better attention to the idea of the politics administration divide, but more comparative work, because we tend to focus on the types of politics administration divides that exist in democratic countries. But actually, these technologies are having big impacts in many other areas, and they're exposing the politics administration divide in new ways. And I think we can get to grips with that impact better if we look at how that divide works in other geographic contexts, and understand therefore how it works closer to home, where we all do our own work.
Thanks. What I have not heard yet is, public administration is a very specific context, right? Where sort of public law also plays an enormous role, and civil rights. So what about that? How can we address that in our theorizing? I mean, Matt, you sort of addressed that in your two papers, but maybe you can sort of elaborate on that question a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will shamelessly plug my good friend Bill Resch at USC, who has repeatedly argued, I would say persuasively, that just as the politics administration divide is sort of a false dichotomy, that the administration and law divide is really sort of an artificial construct. And so that's definitely an important and underutilized way of systematically thinking about the way that the public sector is, the institutional design really around what it is allowed and not allowed to do, and under what conditions may it do some sorts of things and not other sorts of things. And there I would say that there are some really interesting legal scholars. I think Alex's paper cited some work by Kerry Congialesi at, I believe he's at Pittsburgh, or no, Penn.
Penn.
Yeah. So, he's a contributor in a forthcoming Oxford Handbook on AI governance. So hopefully, in bringing that sort of broad, a broad-based perspective in that handbook can also help us identify where some of those linkages are. Ultimately, I think it's on us as researchers, right, to be open at the very least to the possibility for bringing on in these sort of interdisciplinary research project teams, right? Talking to legal scholars and especially administrative legal scholars, and seeing where there are shared interests and opportunities to really synthesize those ideas. I'm 100% in favor of that. It just takes, more work ultimately.
Okay, thanks. I want to discuss a last question before we still have some time for questions from the participants, and that is tying into what you just said, sort of future research. So making it more concrete. If I gave the three of you each 10 million euros or dollars, so what would you research? So what's on top of your agenda, or what would you think is on top or should be on top of the agenda in our field? Shalini.
Yes, Professor. Yeah, $10 million. Okay, so my interests are in the area of thinking, decision making, problem solving. So I would be really interested to develop a large scale study of public sectoral, public managerial thinking and decision making and problem solving in the context of AI and machine learning. And specifically, I'm interested in how these technologies either enhance cognitive processes, what conditions does it lead to automation biases and suboptimal cognitive offloading behaviors. And I'm also interested in how the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning could diminish public managers' own confidence in their own thinking and decision-making abilities over time. This is one of the concerns that comes up in digital technologies in general among emergency managers. But it's a question to explore because emergency managers say that that technologies do it better. They're using some kind of metacognitive processing to say that, well, I can't remember things like this, and I can't decipher patterns, and I probably won't make the right decision over here. So, and this is a this is an important question in any field, but it's really important in public management because the decisions are can be, have such high stakes. So managers' own confidence and ability in their thinking in the context of working in close relationship with these technologies in the contemporary world and into the future is a big question. I'm also interested in experimental studies of task redesign and organizational redesign, and seeing how these questions of role ambiguity and role conflict and optimal levels of information processing and new types of communication routines, if we could develop new types of routines and test them out to see under which context they lead to more satisfying decisions and more better decisions. Hard to say what a better decision is in the public managerial context, but if we were to calibrate it somehow, at least in terms of the satisfaction of that decision, that would be a really interesting kind of area to explore.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, excellent question. I'd point to a couple of different areas. One is if we think of the challenge of artificial intelligence as a wicked problem that will require forms of collaboration to address, we need to get better at collaborating in these areas, both with business and with citizens. So I'd want to find out how we can do better collaboration with those two different types of stakeholders in particular. And a second area is touching on what I mentioned earlier in looking at the impact of technologies on non-developed nations, and particularly getting a better grasp, as we have in other areas of public administration, of how technology innovation, diffusion, and adoption happens. I think we don't yet know enough about how this works for big data technologies. It's a much more energy intensive and knowledge intensive type of technology. And we don't yet know enough about how the development of new products, their adoption and diffusion occurs across different countries in the world. And I think that's important to understand, because these are such powerful technologies, and they're going to have big impacts on a range of different countries for different reasons. So I think it'd be good if we had better understanding of how that works.
Thanks, Matt.
Great. So I think a lot of what I would like to do closely mirrors what Shalini and Alex have already talked about. So I would really like to take those 10 million euro and develop a comparative international set of experimental conditions to look at what sort of individual, as far as the actual human agent working with the technology, but then the institutional factors as they, both are shared across those different contexts, but also differ, right? How do they drive things like the propensity for automation bias on the part of the users, and the sort of legal reactions, regulatory apparatus, incentive structures versus sort of top-down approaches. On the sort of evaluation empirical research side, I think there's an obvious case to be made for identifying instances where this technology is already in place and being used to drive public sector decision-making and outputs, to assess, whether pre-post or whatever's possible, what the actual outcomes are, right? Are there material harms, or really, maybe less normatively and more from positivist, how is the the decision outcome landscape shape changed through this introduction. Another question I have is, AI, modern machine learning, is incredibly data hungry. It's not that it's really a new technology per se, right? They were working on this stuff before I was born, and I'm not that young anymore. But it's really come to be useful because of the exponential growth in the datafication and the lowering costs of data capture and storage, right? So given that it's so data hungry, how is the increasing use of these systems going to bleed into other facets of public sector decision-making processes and policy? There's a great recent example in the infrastructure bill that was just passed by the US Congress. So nestled within the transportation infrastructure-based elements is support for the further rollout of RFID beacons, which are basically a way to get around the fact that self-driving cars are just a bad technology still, after all this money has been sunk into them. And so now the thinking is, well, if we give bicyclists a little RFID chip that they have to wear on their bikes, that way the car can see that they're there. Well, what if that device stops working and the cyclist is hit? Or what if it's still working, but the driver, thinking that the car is now safe against cyclists, isn't paying attention, right? Who's at fault, right? What does this all mean? These are not insignificant questions. And then the last point I'll raise is the challenge of internal capacity building versus the continuance of the sort of hollow state approach of technology adoption by contract. And so to what extent do we see one get preferenced over the other? I think that may be sadly an easier answer than most, but when we do have different approaches, when some public organizations decide to roll their own and actually hire the staff with the capabilities to do that, how do the outcomes differ? How do the internal organizational processes differ than when you go with a vendor, right? So that would probably use up my 10 million just on those points.
Probably more than that. That's like a lifetime research agenda.
Well, I accept your humble offer of indefinite euros.
Okay. First, I have to win in the lottery, though, or rob some of the bitcoins that are now all over the place, right? So, Louisa, last question.
Well, I would like to pick up a couple of threads, one from Nalini and one from Kirk, and ask, what are the limitations of AI technology in addressing the really complex dynamic problems that we see in the public sector? And for Nalini, emergency managers have long known, last 20 years, have tried to develop fusion centers. They honestly are hopelessly unsuccessful and ineffective. And to what extent is this a function of the lack of capacity of the AI technology to fuse these different sources of data, or the design for doing that? And Kirk, is this a reason that we honestly need a new category of intermediaries to move between the problem-focused context and the AI technology to, explain the results of AI analysis in ways that decision makers can understand?
Kirk, you want to go first?
Well, I'll just pick up. Thank you, Louise, for that. I do think there needs to be, Shalini used the word translator. We're asking an awful lot of these managers and users to co-design very complex tasks. That's not in reality how it can work. They're going to have to start with a shell and learn about that and be asked questions that they might not be aware of. And so it strikes me that and there's just not the capacity, the technical capacity within government to do that, I don't think. So I, there may be a need for the sort of techno-social economic guardian intermediary who can figure out how to create this calibration or more trusted application, whatever set of algorithms that work for people. But I'll finish there. Thanks for asking that question, Louise.
I know we're at already two minutes past the 12:30, but just to answer your question briefly, Louise, I mean, so much of AI and digital technology production is coming from corporations. And these technologies are available for free trial. Like the police department, for example, can just go to Amazon and use a free trial of one of their facial recognition technologies just off the shelf, for 30 days, for 60 days. I think, one of the first things that researchers can do in collaboration with practitioners, emergency managers, or other public managers in the public sector is to develop a guideline or a framework of questions to ask these technologies when they're peddled around, to them. That, how has this data, how did you collect this data, to be able to do that? How did you train the technology? Has it been evaluated and tested? They keep saying, facial recognition technology, always touted as very effective and so accurate, but it's really not. It's really not that accurate. And I think questions like these, they should be able to ask these questions before they try or implement these technologies. And there's also a process of I learned this from my public administration collaborator, procedural legitimacy, right? How are these? We don't often use this in psychology, but procedural legitimacy of actually taking this technology and the process behind implementing it, so that it aligns with the organizational value. So now the technologies are really used, well, this would be really good for us, it'll reduce our work, but it doesn't really align with the organization's value or the public value as the construct is in public management. So I think that would be an initial first step that we could take collaboratively as researchers.
Okay, thanks. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I think this has opened up a very interesting, a lot of interesting fields for discussion. And at PPMG, we are definitely interested and willing in helping to further this agenda and the theory development around it. So thanks a lot, Shalini, Alex, and Matthew, and thanks to everybody around the world for listening in. And for those who are to the west of us, still have a nice day. To the east of us and in Europe, have a good evening and good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
It was a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks so much, Alex.
It went really well, I thought. So
yeah,
really,
it was very
really
good.
nice initiative.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean the Dutch context, of course, is also quite interesting. And I mean the tax office, this is like an enormous data hub and has developed into sort of this mega data processing factory. I mean, it's just amazing. And I'm not sure whether, where this will lead us. And I mean, you could see the last the last months that yeah, things can go awfully wrong there.
Yeah.
So
But they could, you know, as the co-author of Artificial Intelligence and Administrative Evil, let me at least suggest that when guided properly, right, there's a lot of room for material improvements in the way that things like tax processing and payments and everything work. I mean, my God, just the difference between my life in the United States in terms of paying for things and being over here, like, it's so much easier here. The data infrastructure is in place in a way that really does make the US feel a little Stone Age sometimes. So, you know, building on that side of things would be great, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
good. So all the best. Good luck with that.
Thank you very much for moderating.
I don't know whether you're planning to come to PMRC or any other conference. Hopefully in 2022 we can still do these things. We'll see. Then yeah, hope to talk to you again at in person somewhere.
Sounds good.
Okay, all the best
Good.
to
All
you
right.
too.
Have a good night.
Bye. Good night to Leiden.
Bye.